For hundreds of thousands of years, humanity survived by hunting. We gathered fruits and berries. We fished. We used simple tools, the hand axe, flint knives, and then a change. Hello, and welcome back to What's Past This Prologue. This is the channel where we talk about The Story of Civilization by Will and Ariel Durant. And today we're looking still at Volume 1, and we're on Chapter 2, and the first section of Chapter 2, which is called From Hunting to Tillage. This section of the book has a very strong gastronomical theme to it. Will Durant is interested in where our prehistoric ancestors got their food from and what kinds of food they ate. And he wants to give us a flavour when he writes this. The uncertainty of the food supply made these nature peoples almost literally omnivorous. Shellfish, sea urchins, frogs, toads, snails, mice, rats, spiders, earthworms, scorpions, moths, centipedes, locusts, caterpillars, lizards, snakes, boas, dogs, horses, roots, lice, insects, larvae, the eggs of reptiles and birds. There is not one of these but was somewhere a delicacy, or even a pièce de résistance to primitive men. For the vast majority of human history, we have survived as hunters and gatherers. If modern humans can be traced back at least 200, if not 300,000 years, then we can say that for at least 95% of human history, we survived as hunters and gatherers. In this video, we're just focusing on Homo sapiens. We're just focusing on modern humans. Obviously, other archaic humans like Neanderthals and Homo erectus were also hunters and gatherers, but Will Durant has a section later in the first volume which is about other archaic humans, and so I thought we would wait until we get to that phase, to that section of the book, before we talk about that. I'll probably make a video on that later on. So in this video, we're just talking about hunters and gatherers over the last 200,000 to 300,000 years as modern humans. So what do we know about hunters and gatherers? Well, the first thing we should say is we probably should reverse the name, because hunters and gatherers did far more gathering than hunting. They gathered for fruits and berries and plants and grubs. But I suspect that part of the reason why we emphasize hunting is because hunting is more dramatic, and it probably captured the imaginations of early anthropologists. And so we tend to think of them as hunters more than gatherers. But as I say, we probably should be calling them gatherers and hunters. Another thing to note about the name that we give these people is we define them by their mode of existence. This is interesting because we don't do this with modern people. We don't do this with anybody after the Neolithic Revolution. If we did, we'd probably end up calling ourselves industrial agriculturalists. And I do wonder whether historians, if we had some new mode of existence in the future, will look back on all of us and all of human history and say, these people were just industrial agriculturalists, in the same way that they were just hunters and gatherers. Hunter-gatherers were nomadic. They usually traveled in bands of between 25 and 100 people, and the members of each group of hunter-gatherers were usually related to each other. Sometimes they were related matrilineally, but not always. They had certain limits with regards to the group sizes. So if the band of hunter-gatherers became too large, then what they would do is they would split up into two separate groups, and they would go their separate ways. There was very little specialization within the group. Once gender roles have been taken into consideration, all of the people could do basically the same kinds of things. They could all hunt, they could all prepare food, they could all make tools, and so there was very little by way of differences in terms of the hunter-gatherer's abilities. Authority was also situational. If, for example, the group went out to hunt, an individual may assume authority in order to direct the hunt, but as soon as they came back to the camp, their authority immediately vanished. There were no permanent hierarchical positions within most hunter-gatherer groups. These people didn't have much by the way of private property. It's not that they couldn't make things or trade things, it's that moving around as a nomadic group, they simply weren't able to carry large numbers of possessions from one place to another. It wasn't practical. And so, because they didn't have large amounts of private property, these groups were very much more equal and had much greater levels of equality than we do today. If you want inequality and social hierarchies, you really need sedentism rather than nomadism. They also didn't work as much as we do in the modern age. It's been estimated that to feed the entire group, hunter-gatherers would have only had to do about 20 hours work a week. So they had a lot more leisure time. Hunter-gatherers also didn't go hungry. If they wanted food, they would go out and get it. As we've seen, they were omnivorous. They would eat anything they could. And if food wasn't available in the area they were occupying, then they would simply move to a more lush environment where food was more plentiful. These people also don't use land as intensively as farmers do. But because they're so spaced out and because they have a much lower population density, this puts very strict limits on potential numbers in terms of hunter-gatherer populations. It's very difficult to get accurate population figures prior to the Neolithic Revolution, but one estimate that I read suggested there may have been as many as 4 million people on the planet about 12,000 years ago. Now, it's very clear that the huge population increases that we've seen over the last 12,000 years are a consequence of agriculture and food surpluses. It would be quite impossible for us to sustain a population. We simply wouldn't have enough land to feed 8 billion people if we reverted back to hunter-gatherer ways. It's one of the great ironies of history that famine arrived at the same time that farmers were producing agricultural surpluses. That's not to say that there were never any individual or groups of hunter-gatherers that went hungry, because of course they did. But it is to say that if you're going to have widespread famine, you need to have people who are fixed to the land, and then you need to have crop failure. One of the things that Durant wants to emphasize with this section of the book is the considerable ingenuity of our prehistoric ancestors. He writes this: "With what skill those ancestors ferreted out from land and sea the food that was the basis of their simple societies. They grubbed edible things from the earth with bare hands. They imitated or used the claws and tusks of the animals. They fashioned tools out of ivory, bone, or stone. They made nets and traps and snares of rushes and fibers. They devised innumerable artifices for fishing and hunting their prey." One of the things we should keep in mind, though, is that there would have been tremendous variety in terms of the ways in which hunter-gatherers operated, because they would have had to adapt to the various different climates and environments they were living in. By the time we get to the late Paleolithic, human beings had spread over large parts of the earth, and so we would have had hunter-gatherers in Arctic conditions, we would have had hunter-gatherers in the tropics, they would have been in the plains, and so they would have had to adapt to the local flora and fauna, the plants and animals of their environment. They would have also had to adapt to the gradual environmental and climatic changes that would have taken place over hundreds of thousands of years. And so we shouldn't assume that they were static. They were adapting to the changes that took place over this long period of human history. Nevertheless, we know that they ate leafy vegetables and fruits. We know that they had grindstones or millstones, and they used those to grind up grain and nuts and seeds, as well as other plants. They installed fishing weirs in rivers in order to help them fish. They also had control of fire, and they developed cooking. We know they had earth ovens. And Durant talks in this section, he talks about the importance of cooking in the development of civilization. And he says this: "Cooking broke down the cellulose and starch of 1,000 plants indigestible in their raw state, and man turned more and more to cereals and vegetables as his chief reliance. At the same time, cooking, by softening tough foods, reduced the need for chewing, and began that decay of the teeth, which is one of the insignia of civilization." He doesn't mention it in this section, but obviously cooking at higher temperatures would have killed bacteria and viruses and parasites, and this would have helped with the development of human health. So what are some of the misconceptions that we have about people from the Paleolithic? Well, I think the biggest misconception is that we assume that they spent all of their time hunting megafauna. Why is this the case? Why do we have this misconception? Well, I think part of it comes from the fossil record. And in the fossil record, we have evidence of a lot of bones from dead animals that were killed by hunter-gatherers. But what doesn't often appear in the fossil record, or at least to the same degree, is the fossilized remains of small grubs or plants that were eaten by hunter-gatherers. There are fossilized plants. Archaeologists have discovered plants that were used by hunter-gatherers. But I think it's easier to find fossilized large bones from megafauna than it is to find the remains of tiny little grubs that were consumed by these people. Another misconception about our Paleolithic ancestors would have been the role of scavenging. Scavenging doesn't really get talked about very much, but it's very likely that people were involved in quite a lot of scavenging. And what they would have done is they would have waited and watched other animals, predators, chasing after their prey. And they would have waited until the predator had killed its prey, and then they would have got stones, rocks, and thrown it at the predator and chased the animal away. And then they would have stolen the dead carcass, the carcass of the dead animal, and they would have taken it back to the camp and cooked and eaten it. Scavenging would have almost certainly played a large role for hunter-gatherers, but again, it doesn't really get much play in terms of popular imagination with regards to people during this period. Another misconception that we have is this idea that there is a clear distinction between farmers and hunter-gatherers. In reality, the transition to agriculture would have taken a very long time. It would have been a very gradual transition, and it's possible that people would have been simultaneously doing some hunting and gathering whilst also beginning to grow crops. And this process would have probably gone on for hundreds, if not thousands of years. In the modern world, we're so used to the idea that human beings are the dominant species on the planet that we find it very difficult to imagine a time when human beings were just as much prey as they were predators. But in truth, for large periods of our history, we were in conflict with other animals on the planet, and it wasn't clear that we were going to become as dominant as we have become. Durant describes this in this section. He talks about this as a war, and he says this: "For hunting was not merely a quest for food. It was a war for security and mastery, a war besides which all the wars of recorded history are but a little noise. We see in our museums the relics of that war of the species, in the knives, clubs, spears, arrows, lassos, bolas, laws, traps, boomerangs, and slings, with which primitive men won possession of the land and prepared to transmit to an ungrateful posterity the gift of security from every beast except man." And how very ungrateful we are. We hardly ever think about the trials and tribulations that our prehistoric ancestors had to go through in order for us to win the security that we currently enjoy. We wouldn't be where we are today in society without their achievements. Evolutionary adaptations to hunter-gatherer lifestyles shaped our species. Now, some of the traits that we developed as a result of being hunter-gatherers probably predated Homo sapiens and are found in other archaic humans. The traits we're thinking about which would have been useful for hunter-gathering are things like bipedalism, increased brain size, improvements in communications abilities of humans, as well as improvements in cooperation, increased ability at tool making and problem solving. These things would have been very useful and helped hunter-gatherers survive, and then they would have passed those traits on to subsequent generations. In 1968, a book was published called Man the Hunter. It was based on a symposium that was held for anthropologists. And the basis of this book is that if you want to understand human evolution, you have to have an understanding of hunting. Along with placing hunting at the center of human evolution was the idea that the consumption of meat and animal products led to increased cognitive abilities within human beings. Now, the central idea here is that meat is an important source of protein and fats and nutrients, and that this would lead to increased brain size, and that increased brain size would improve cognitive abilities in our species. This idea was very popular among anthropologists in the 1960s, but it's not so popular today. It's kind of fallen out of fashion. Another theory that is very popular is this idea that cooking is central to our evolutionary development. And the basic idea here is that cooking helped to break up and soften up food, and this meant that human beings were able to develop smaller teeth as well as a smaller digestive tract. And with an increasingly energy-efficient form of digestion, we were able to instead put more energy into larger brain size and increased cognitive ability. Again, this is an idea that a lot of people believe to be true, although some people don't think it's true. But I just thought I would give you a kind of taste of some of the different theories that are out there with regards to the evolutionary development of our Paleolithic ancestors. Another theory that has been suggested in terms of how our prehistoric ancestors affect us today is this idea that culture began with hunter-gatherers sitting around a campfire telling each other stories. The basic idea here is they sat around, told these stories, and this helped to develop language. And then that language and that storytelling ability has developed into human culture that can be reflected all the way up to the present with regards to things like film and television and novels and so forth, and that there's supposed to be a direct through line from campfire storytelling all the way to the modern, in the prehistoric period, all the way to the modern age. Since the vast majority of human history has been as hunters and gatherers, it's not really surprising that we are, in some respects, very maladapted to our modern mode of existence. I mean, the most obvious example of this is the way in which we seem, as a species, incapable of adapting to a more sedate lifestyle that we live. We simply don't move as much as we used to. Hunter-gatherers walked great distances. They ran a lot of the time. And so we don't do that. And so you can see the effects on human health of having this more sedate lifestyle. Another way in which we are maladapted to the modern world is that through most of our history, we had tight-knit social groups. As I say, we lived in bands of 25 to 100 people. How do you build up any sense of social solidarity in a society that doesn't have 25 or 100 people, but has 25 or 100 million people? It's actually very difficult to create a kind of social cohesion when we move to larger and larger numbers of people. Another thing that we struggle with from an evolutionary perspective is urbanization. The majority of the world's population now live in urban areas, and yet urban areas have large amounts of noise and pollution and artificial light, and human beings are not used to this from an evolutionary perspective. For most of our history, we didn't have these kind of large urban areas, and so what you're seeing is that the particularly artificial light, which is disrupting people's circadian rhythms, is creating in people a sense of a stress and anxiety, which triggers a fight or flight response. The fight or flight response was a perfectly reasonable response in the Paleolithic, but in the modern world, it's just not really appropriate to have a fight or flight response in most social situations. And so it's another example of how we have this legacy from the past, which lives in people today, and how we're just not adapted to the modern world that we've created. What are you doing, buddy? Human intelligence, or for that matter, any form of intelligence, animal intelligence, is actually very difficult to define. We don't have clear definitions, and we actually don't have very good ways of measuring it. That being said, it would be a mistake for people to believe that hunter-gatherers are somehow less intelligent than we are. There is absolutely no evidence that they were less intelligent. They were less knowledgeable than we are today, but that's not really surprising given that we have 60 centuries of history from which we've been able to build up knowledge about the world. In some respects, they would have been more knowledgeable than us. I mean, they would know more about the plants and animals in their environment than we do, or at least the most of us do. They would have also been probably better at working in small groups, and they would have been better in terms of tool making. The average person today would do a very poor job in trying to make tools, but almost all hunter-gatherers would have been able to make tools. It would be a big mistake for people to think of them as stupid, because they certainly weren't stupid. Another potential legacy of our prehistoric past is human beings' propensity for violence. I have read a few times that the propensity that we have for violence is a remnant of our hunting past, that to survive as hunter-gatherers we had to be very violent, and that this has led to modern society being violent. I've also read, and it's in this section with Durant references it, is this idea that you can see a legacy of violence that we have in the games that children play, particularly young boys. He writes a little bit about this. He mentions this in this section, and I'm going to read a part of it to you. He writes this: "Hunting and fishing were not stages in economic development. They were modes of activity destined to survive into the highest forms of civilized society. Once the center of life, they are still its hidden foundations. Behind our literature and philosophy, our ritual and art, stand the stout killers of Packingtown. We do our hunting by proxy, not having the stomach for honest killing in the fields. But our memories of the chase linger on in our joyful pursuit of anything weak or fugitive, and in the games of our children, even in the word game. In the last analysis, civilization is based on the food supply. The cathedral and the capital, the museum and the concert chamber, the library and the university are the facade. In the rear are the shambles. The word shambles here is an archaic word for slaughterhouse or abattoir. Packingtown here is a reference to the Union stockyards in Chicago. They don't exist anymore. They've been closed down. I think they're a museum now. But at one point, they were the largest meatpacking facility in the whole world. In 1906, Upton Sinclair published a novel called The Jungle, and some of the characters in that novel worked in Packingtown in the Union stockyards. And the purpose of this novel was to try and raise awareness about the awful conditions of working class people. Its unintended and actual consequence was to raise public awareness of the filthy conditions of the completely unsanitary conditions of the meatpacking industry at that point. It's interesting to me because for all the theoretical regulations we have over slaughterhouses, the truth is that most of the world's slaughterhouses are still fairly unsanitary and probably kind of filthy conditions. And occasionally we see instances of this. What we tend to do is that we tend to, in the modern world, if something makes us uncomfortable, we kind of try and push it away. And this is precisely what we do with abattoirs, right? We put them in rural areas, and there are practical reasons why abattoirs have to be in rural areas. They need lots of space. But there are also less creditable reasons why we do this. We do this because we don't want to think about it. We don't want to think about the psychological effect that killing lots of animals has on the people that work in these slaughterhouses. We don't want to think about that. We also don't want to think about the noises of the abattoir or the smells of the abattoir. So instead, we are exactly as Durant says in this section. Most people, myself included, I will confess to this, don't really have the stomach for honest killing, and so we get other people to do it on our behalf, and we push it away into rural areas. Our whole philosophy as a society is not just with this, but with lots of issues, is out of sight, out of mind. We just push it away and hope not to think about it too much. The next part of this section is on what Durant calls primitive improvidence. And the basic idea here is that prehistoric peoples didn't prepare for the future. And I'm going to read a line from this section, and it's a good line, and I'm going to tell you what Durant says. The moment man begins to take thought of the morrow, he passes out of the Garden of Eden into the vale of anxiety. This quote serves basically two functions in the section. The first one is to point out the important conceptual shift which is going on here, which is to say that human beings are going from being more passive to being more active in terms of thinking about their lives and thinking about their future. We're going from accepting what the environment gives us to dramatically reshaping the environment in our own interest. And this is both an important conceptual shift that human beings are making, but it also has a profound psychological effect on human beings. That is to say, that it creates a real sense of anxiety. And the reason for this is you would think that if agriculture produces larger food supplies, this would reduce anxiety. But Durant's point is the exact opposite, which is to say that once you move away from thinking that the environment will provide for you, you start to worry about whether or not there will be crop failure, whether or not the civilization that you're creating based on agriculture is going to be good. In other words, it produces a kind of general anxiety about the future. The second thing I want to say about this quote is more speculative, but I absolutely will stand by it because I'm 100% right. And that is to say that it's very clear to me when I read that this idea of human beings going from the Garden of Eden to the Vale of Anxiety, I think this is a very clear reference to the allegorical interpretation of the Garden of Eden story, or at least one of them. Allegorical interpretations of the Bible are as old as the Bible itself, right? The people have been interpreting it in allegorical ways since it's been written. One of the ones that has become more popular in terms of how we interpret the Garden of Eden story is that it is a reference to this transition from hunter-gathering to agriculture. In the Garden of Eden, we were living in paradise, and that this was our hunter-gatherer phase, and then we were exiled from Eden. We had our fall, and we were sort of banished from Eden, and then we transitioned to farming. We lost our innocence. We were innocent in a state of nature, and then we lost our innocence and we created civilization. I think that Durant absolutely is. I think he chose this particular turn of phrase deliberately because he's trying to reference that interpretation of the Garden of Eden story. I don't think that's a coincidence. What was interesting to me is that when I read that, I wondered who was the first person to come up with this interpretation, because there are people that talk about it today, and I couldn't find anybody who was putting that particular interpretation of the Garden of Eden story. I couldn't find anybody doing it earlier than the 1930s. And Durant wrote this book in the late 20s. And so I'm not saying that Durant created this idea, but I'm not saying that he didn't either. I'm sure there are people who came up with this idea earlier than Durant, but I just wasn't able to find examples of them. And so if you have examples of them, you can let me know. I should say, he doesn't explicitly state that that's what he's doing by talking about the Garden of Eden to the Vale of Anxiety. But why would you say that in this particular moment? Like, it just seems so clear to me that he's pinning our prehistoric past to Eden, and then he's putting the exile, the fall from Eden, as the post-agriculture when we became part of farming communities. So that's one way of interpreting what he's saying there, and people can disagree if they want, I suppose. I just ramble, don't I? Just ramble and ramble and ramble. One of the fundamental questions that is always raised by the Garden of Eden narrative is whether or not mankind's loss of innocence was a good thing. The same kind of question can be raised with regards to the transition from hunter-gathering to agriculture. Was this transition a good thing? That's a pretty fundamental question. When you think about questions like that, for me, there are two philosophers that immediately spring to mind. And those are, you probably know, those are obviously Thomas Hobbes and Jean-Jacques Rousseau, both of whom were interested in what life was like in a state of nature before civilization. So they have contrasting views. So Hobbes, for him, life in a state of nature is nasty, brutish, and short. Whereas for Jean-Jacques Rousseau, people living in a state of nature are noble savages. And for him, man is born free and everywhere is in chains. That's the famous quote about how civilization is corrupting mankind. It's important to say that neither Hobbes nor Rousseau are really talking about our prehistoric past. What they're actually talking about, of course, is their own times. So when Hobbes writes The Leviathan, what he's really talking about is the restoration of Charles II and after the interregnum. And for Rousseau, what he's really talking about is the inequality and injustices of French society during the 18th century. And so, but they both have these like contrasting ideas about the state of nature. And I think you can decide: was civilization a corrupting force, or was it a force for good for mankind? I'll make 1 point for Hobbes. I'll give you 1 point in Hobbes's favor, which is to say that if we're thinking about whether or not our Paleolithic past was nasty, brutish, and short, it is worth noting that nomadic people during that period practiced both infanticide and senilicide at much, much higher rates. So for me, that's a pretty strong case on Hobbes' side. But you can have your own opinion, I suppose. I suppose I'm willing to let you have your own opinion. We are only on chapter 2, but so far, this is my favorite quote from Durant in the book, and there are probably ones that will beat it later on, but this is my favorite quote right now. Durant writes this. He says, "Sometimes, during a walk in the woods, one is awed by the variety of languages spoken there, by the myriad species of insects, reptiles, carnivores, and birds. One feels that man is an interloper on this crowded scene, that he is an object of universal dread and endless hostility." I can't quite articulate why it is I like this quote so much. I think it has to do with this idea of man as an interloper, as an object of universal dread. We will never be able to go back to being just another species on the planet. When we approach a wild animal, it's likely to run away in fear, and it's right to do so. We are the outsiders in the story of life. And the reason for this is because our self-awareness has separated us out from all the other animals. And although our self-awareness is a great gift, it also has with it, I think, a lot of sadness. From being separated out from the animals, we take a step back. And from a distance, we watch them. And from the animals, we learn the art of provision. Or at least, that's what our author says. He writes, "The dog that buried the bone which even a canine appetite could not manage, the squirrel that gathered nuts for a later feast, the bees that filled the comb with honey, the ants that laid up stores for a rainy day, these were among the first creators of civilization. It was they, or other subtle creatures like them, who taught our ancestors the art of providing for tomorrow out of the surplus of today, or of preparing for winter in summer's time of plenty." This is absolutely classic Durant. Did our ancestors actually learn the art of provision by watching animals? I don't know. You don't know. Nobody knows. But it's such a great story and it's such a great idea that I'm just inclined to believe that, yeah, it's probably true. There aren't really many hunter-gatherers left in the world today. There are at most a few 100,000, and they're living in fairly remote parts of South America, some remote parts of Africa, and in Indonesia and New Guinea, I think. There are some people who have been deliberately isolated from the rest of the world. So there are tribes in the Brazilian rainforest that are being protected by the Brazilian government that have no contact with the outside world. And there is an island in the Andaman Islands in the Indian Ocean which is being protected by the Indian Navy, and no one is supposed to visit, and it's supposed to be completely cut off from civilization. The hunter-gatherers that are not being isolated from the rest of civilization were extensively studied in the 20th century. And the idea was that if you studied hunter-gatherer lifestyles, you could learn not only about how they live today or how they lived over the last century, but rather how people lived in the Paleolithic. Now, the big question about this is how similar are modern hunter-gatherers to our Paleolithic ancestors? And that's really an open question that has never really been satisfactorily answered. Historically, most hunters and gatherers were ultimately displaced by farming communities, but I can't really talk about that in this video because I want to cover it in the next video. This section, this From Hunting to Tillage, had so much material in it that I'm going to have to split it into two videos. This video was basically on the hunting and gathering section, and the next video is going to be on the tillage or agriculture section. When did agriculture begin? Why did it begin? Where did it begin? Those are the kinds of things I'm going to talk about, and I'm going to talk about what Durant says about that, because he has quite a lot to say about that. So I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you'll join me for the next one, and yeah, I'll see you later. Bye.